For the Alliance for a Just Society found that the cost of living for a childless adult in Idaho is $14.57, which is almost double the federal minimum wage. And that's for childless people, not taking into account families where one parent might stay at home but can't afford to. So as a proponent of family values, at what point do you balance that with your view on the federal minimum wage?
Well, I think the misnomer is that the federal minimum wage is actually going to increase the living wage for a lot of people permanently. What we need to do is actually give people the opportunity to get better jobs. My mother lived on minimum wage for a long time. I was raised by a single mother. She actually lived on minimum wage for a long time. And what she did for herself is she took advantage of opportunities to go to school, to get a better education, and then to encourage me to actually go to school so I wouldn't have to live the same kind of life that she was living. And I think unfortunately what we do is we try to fix this problem by encouraging people to raise the minimum wage, when the reality is that all studies show that if we raise the minimum wage, what you're going to do is you're going to lose those entry-level jobs that people need to be trained so they can actually advance in life. I worked minimum wage jobs as a young man since the age of 14. So I could actually get the skills and abilities and that I needed so I could be successful. That minimum wage job that I had, plus the ability to go to college, which my mom actually instilled in me, is what allowed me to have a better life as an adult. And I was able to get out of the cycle that my mother was in when she was living in a lot of minimum wage jobs. So I think what we need to do when we're policymakers, we can talk about feel-good legislation, but the reality is that if we don't improve the lives and the ability for people to actually get better jobs in America, we're going to have a lot of people that for generation after generation are going to be living in those minimum wage jobs. And we can raise that minimum wage however much we want, but if they're continuously living under that minimum wage, they're not going to be able to provide for their families.
Would you like to respond to that?
I would like to respond to that. There are situations where studies have been made between states that raise the minimum wage and those that do not. Certainly in the state of Idaho, we have a contiguous state, Washington, where the minimum wage is much higher, and places where it's been possible to study those side-by-side states, one raising the minimum wage and one not. There has not been evidence of some of the dire consequences that the Congressman mentions here. And frankly, currently the federal minimum wage is $7.35 an hour. Now that is not an amount of money that anybody can support a family on, that anybody can actually live on. And to me, that makes it just immoral. If somebody's business plan involves being able to pay somebody poverty wages, then we really need to look at how that needs to be improved.
See, and the difference is that I don't want people living on minimum wage jobs. I want them to improve their lives so they can actually get higher wages, just like my mother did and just like I did.
So very briefly, a question for you, Congressman. How do you do that?
You do by increasing the economy, by improving the economy. One of the things that I want to do is tax reform. I want to get rid of all these loopholes that these corporations have so we can actually encourage big companies to come to the United States and stay in the United States instead of going abroad to other countries. Another thing that I would love to do here in Idaho is to have more control of our federal lands. One of the things that we have right now is the richest areas in Idaho used to be where we had timber harvesting. Now it's so difficult to do timber harvesting that you actually need a college education to make a good wage. You can actually make a good wage right out of high school if you work in timber, in mining, in those areas. But the federal government has actually made it more difficult for young people in the state to take advantage of those jobs. That's what I want to do. I want to create an economic growth, an economic boom that will allow people, even without a college education or just with some limited after high school education, to actually get high-paying jobs.
And the next question is actually related to this from Rebecca Boone for Congressman Labrador.
Congressman, Idaho has a wealth of natural resources, particularly in the 1st District, but there's no agreement, easy agreement anyway, over how those resources should be handled. The Payment in Lieu of Taxes program was extended for 1 year as part of the 2014 Farm Bill, but the temporary extension still leaves rural counties, especially counties like Idaho County, where a huge portion of their land is in federal land jurisdiction. It leaves them in limbo, wondering how they're going to replace the funding if it expires next year. Should PILT have a permanent funding source, and if so, where should that money come from?
I think it should, and it's because there's an obligation of the federal government to the state. You have to distinguish that from SRS, from Secure Rural Schools. You know, SRS was supposed to be just a 10-year plan or something like that. PILT is actually because the government owes us the money because we're not using those federal lands. Now, I would advocate for us being allowed to use those federal lands more. And if you talk to actually the Idaho County Commissioners, they would agree with me. If they have the ability to use their lands, they're going to need less and less payments from the federal government. It's one of the reasons that I introduced timber legislation that would allow us to control 200,000 acres in Idaho under state management rules. They would still remain under the ownership of the federal government, but we can control it under state management rules. If you talk to all those people in those regions, they understand that they're now dependent on the federal government, and they don't want to be dependent. They actually want to be able to be independent and use those natural resources so we can create jobs and create more wealth in Idaho.
You had a follow-up.
I did. Given the precarious year-to-year nature of PILT funding currently, is it ever the obligation, I mean, should the counties ever start looking for alternate sources of funding?
And yes, and they are. The counties actually came to me in Congress and asked for them to have the opportunity to manage these lands at the state level. So this idea actually came from the county commissioners, and I think they're also looking for as many ways as possible to make ends meet in their counties.
The next question was for Representative Ringo.
And Representative, I have the same question for you. Should PILT have a permanent funding source, and if so, where should that money come from?
Yes. First of all, there's always been a lot of discussion over the years to have state management of federal lands, and it's something that our Attorney General even says is not feasible. So I think what we need to do in order to be productive is to look at how to make the current system work better. We need to reform the national forest system and work harder on the multiple use aspects of those federal lands that we have here in Idaho. And in addition, there are two sources of funding that are important. The PILT you mentioned is a very important source of funding that the federal government owes to us because of the tax base we lose with the federal lands here. And I do think that needs a source of funding, yes. Secondly, we used to have the law that was passed, I think, in 1908 that gave the counties a share of the revenue on federal lands to use for schools and roads. That was essentially replaced, as I understand it, by the Safe and Secure Rural Schools Act. Nonetheless, that's a very important source of revenue for our rural counties to help support their schools and for their roads. So I think that funding is important, and if we're going to make this system work as it should, we have to have the federal government find the source of funding for both of those programs.
Can I correct something just for a second?
Please.
The Attorney General has never spoken about my plan. The Attorney General has spoken about ownership of state land by the state. I mean, of federal land by the state. My plan is actually managing federal land under our state management practices, and I don't think the state attorney general has ever spoken to that issue, and it's actually one of the things that the county commissioners brought to me because they would prefer the ownership of the land, but they realized how difficult that is, and they thought this was something. And in fact, Ron Wyden from Oregon, who's a senator, a Democratic senator, is looking at something similar like my trust idea. So.
And I will say that I was talking about shifting the federal land management to the state that's been discussed for so long and not the congressman's specific proposal.
You had a follow-up question, Rebecca?
Yes, Representative Ringo, you talked about needing a permanent funding source and the federal government's obligation to do that, but you also talked about counties learning how to operate as best they can within the current status quo because it sounded like you said they have to start working with what they currently have in addition to using the federal PILT funding. What are some ways that they could do that? Can they really replace that? Can they really focus their efforts in places like Idaho County without managing those federal lands? And how would they do that? I mean, increased infrastructure. What needs to happen?
Yeah, I'm not sure I heard myself say that, but let me just address the issue. What I was saying that I thought in order to make the system work more appropriately, we need to have a reform of the national forest system, and there's supposed to be the multiple use provision of these lands, which does give the opportunity for the income that can come off of those lands. So that would be a piece of it. I think I might have actually heard the congressman say that, and not myself, but I could be wrong.
Thank you.
I've
I'm sorry.
had
I
that
think I must-
experience where a reporter hears something different than I do, so that's okay.
We're terrible. It's true. The next question from a terrible